A 16-year-old boy stands alone on a hill overlooking a football game he isn't watching. Everyone else is down there, cheering, belonging to something. He's up here by himself, in a red hunting cap, about to get kicked out of his fourth school. He's not sad about it, exactly. He's furious. Furious at almost everyone and everything around him. Teachers, classmates, movies, conversations, the entire machinery of becoming an adult. He has a word for all of it: phony. And once you start looking at the world through his eyes, it's very hard to stop noticing how much of it he might actually be right about. This is Holden Caulfield. Published in 1951, The Catcher in the Rye became one of the most read, most banned, and most argued about books in American literature. A novel that somehow feels like it was written yesterday, no matter what decade you read it in. Most people remember it as a story about teenage rebellion. It's really a story about grief that a teenager doesn't have the tools to name yet, wearing rebellion as a disguise. Let's go inside it. Here's the first thing you need to understand about how this book works. Holden is telling you this story from somewhere. He mentions early on that he's currently out here, resting, and that his brother DB visits him on Sundays. It's only by the end of the novel that you understand what that actually means. Holden is narrating all of this from a mental hospital or sanatorium in California, sometime after the events he's describing. Everything you're about to hear happened in the past. He survived it, but something clearly broke, or nearly broke, along the way. The story itself covers just 2 or 3 days right before Christmas, sometime in the late 1940s. Holden has just been expelled from Pensy Prep, an expensive boarding school in Pennsylvania. His 4th school in as many years. He's failed almost every class except English, the one subject he actually cares about, because he loves reading and writing far more than he loves institutions. Rather than wait around for the official end of term, Holden decides to leave campus immediately, days early, and head into New York City on his own, without telling his parents he's coming. He's not due home until Wednesday, when they're expecting him back for Christmas break, which means Holden has several completely unsupervised days and nights in Manhattan, with cash in his pocket, nowhere he's required to be, and absolutely no plan. That premise alone tells you almost everything about who Holden is. He's a kid who's been failed repeatedly by structure, schools that don't fit him, adults who don't really see him, and his response isn't to build a plan of his own. It's to disappear into the city and see what happens. Salinger gives him total freedom at exactly the moment he's least equipped to handle it. If there's one word that defines Holden's entire way of seeing the world, it's phony. He uses it constantly, applying it to almost every adult and most of his peers. Teachers who pretend to care, boys at school who fake friendliness, actors, his brother DB, who used to write serious short stories but now, in Holden's eyes, has prostituted himself writing for Hollywood. Before he even leaves Pensy, Holden visits his elderly history teacher, Mr. Spencer, to say a kind of goodbye. Spencer means well, but he can't resist lecturing Holden about his failing grades, reading Holden's own miserable exam essay back to him out loud, trying to get him to see that life is a game you're supposed to play by the rules. Holden nods along, says the right things, and privately can't stand a second of it. It's the first of many scenes where Holden performs politeness while seething underneath, which is, ironically, exactly the kind of phoniness he claims to hate in everyone else. That contradiction is one of the most important things about this book, and it's easy to miss on a first read. Holden calls out phoniness in everyone around him, but he lies constantly himself, to strangers on trains, to dates, to nuns he meets in a sandwich shop, to basically everyone he interacts with in New York. He invents entire fake identities on the spot, tells a stranger's mother elaborate lies about her son being shy and beloved when Holden actually can't stand the kid, and never once seems to notice the irony. He's not a reliable narrator in the traditional sense, and Salinger seems to want you to notice that. Holden isn't uniquely honest in a world of liars. He's a deeply unhappy kid who has decided that pointing out other people's fakeness is safer than sitting with his own pain. There's also a specific kind of phoniness Holden reserves special contempt for: performance dressed up as sincerity. He can't stand actors who are good in that showy, self-congratulatory way. He can't stand people who say grand or glad to have met you when they clearly don't mean it. He can't even fully trust his own brother DB anymore because DB used to write the kind of short stories Holden genuinely admired and now writes scripts for Hollywood money instead, which Holden reads not as a reasonable career choice, but as a kind of quiet betrayal. A talented person selling off the one part of himself Holden actually respected. Underneath all of it is the same fear, restated over and over in different costumes, that the adult world runs on people quietly agreeing to fake it, and that growing up means eventually agreeing to fake it too. Back at the dorm, before he leaves for good, Holden gets into a real physical fight with his roommate, Stradlater, a handsome, confident, somewhat careless guy who's just been on a date with Jane Gallagher, a girl Holden used to spend time with and clearly still cares about, though he can barely admit that to himself. Holden becomes obsessed with whether Stradlater tried anything with Jane during the date, presses him about it aggressively, and eventually attacks him. Stradlater, much stronger, pins him down easily and bloodies his nose without much effort. It's not a dramatic fight, it's almost pathetic, which is exactly the point. Holden isn't capable of protecting the people he cares about, even in his imagination, let alone in reality. That failure is going to become the emotional engine of the entire rest of the book. Once Holden arrives in Manhattan and checks into a cheap hotel, the novel becomes a kind of restless, aimless drift through New York. Bars, hotel lounges, taxi rides, phone booths, where he considers calling people and then doesn't. He's surrounded by other people constantly, and he has never felt more alone. From his hotel room, Holden can see into other guests' windows across the courtyard, and what he witnesses there, adults engaging in behavior he finds both upsetting and secretly fascinating, leaves him disturbed in a way he can't quite process or articulate. It's one of several moments where Holden brushes up against the adult world of sex and intimacy and recoils, half out of genuine discomfort, half out of a kind of self-protective disgust. He's 16, deeply lonely, and has almost no healthy models for what real intimacy or connection actually looks like. He calls a woman named Faith Cavendish, whose number he got secondhand, hoping for company, and the call goes nowhere. He goes to a nightclub downstairs and dances with 3 unimpressive women from out of town, buying them drinks he can't really afford, just to have someone to talk to. Later that night, in a moment that captures his loneliness better than almost anything else in the book, Holden agrees to have a prostitute named Sunny sent up to his hotel room. Not really out of desire, it turns out, but because he's desperate enough for some kind of human contact that he's willing to pay for the appearance of it. When she actually arrives, he loses his nerve almost immediately, tells her he just wants to talk, and ends up paying her anyway, awkwardly, just to make her leave. It doesn't go smoothly. Her pimp, Maurice, shows up later demanding more money and rattles Holden badly, both physically and emotionally. Threaded through all of this restless wandering is a small, strange, recurring detail. Holden keeps wondering out loud to taxi drivers who have no interest in the question, where the ducks in the Central Park Lagoon go when it freezes over in winter. It sounds like a throwaway joke the first time it comes up. It isn't. It's Holden quietly asking, in the only language he has access to, what happens to vulnerable small things when the world turns cold and hostile. He's not really asking about ducks. To understand why Holden is the way he is, you have to understand what he's carrying, because for most of the book, he barely lets you see it directly. 3 years before the novel begins, Holden's younger brother Allie died of leukemia. Allie was, by every account Holden gives, brilliant and kind. A boy who wrote poems in green ink all over his own baseball mitt so he'd have something to read out in the field when nobody was hitting to him. When Allie died, Holden, who was 13 at the time, broke every window in the family garage with his bare hands, in grief so overwhelming it became physical violence directed at himself. He still carries Allie's baseball glove around with him. He still, occasionally, talks to Allie out loud, asking him not to let him disappear. Salinger never states outright that Holden's entire spiral through New York is a grief reaction. He doesn't have to. Once you know about Allie, nearly everything else in the book reads differently, Holden's obsession with phoniness is partly a 13-year-old's furious, unprocessed anger that the universe let something so unfair happen to someone so good. His fixation on protecting innocence, his horror at anything that feels like corruption or loss, his inability to let himself get close to anyone without pulling back, all of it traces back to a loss he was too young to have any real tools for handling, and that nobody around him seems to have properly helped him process. Notice, too, that Allie isn't the only death sitting quietly underneath this novel. Holden mentions, almost in passing, a boy from an earlier school named James Castle, who died by suicide after being bullied, and Holden was one of the only people who tried to comfort him in his final hours. He carries that death, too, alongside Allie's, without ever fully naming what either loss actually did to him. The one person who does reach him, even briefly, is his 10-year-old sister Phoebe. Late at night, Holden sneaks into his own apartment to see her without their parents knowing he's back in the city early. Phoebe is sharp, funny, and immediately sees through him in a way almost no adult in the book manages to. When Holden admits he's been expelled again, she doesn't buy his excuses. She challenges him directly. Name one thing you actually like. Holden struggles, genuinely struggles, to answer, landing eventually on a few nuns he met earlier that day, his dead brother Allie, and talking to Phoebe herself. It's a small, devastating moment. A boy who claims to see through everyone else's fakeness can barely locate anything real that he still loves. It's in this same conversation that Holden tells Phoebe his fantasy, the one that gives the book its title. He imagines a huge field of rye, full of little kids playing right at the edge of a cliff. Nobody's watching them, and his job, the only job he wants in the world, is to stand at that edge and catch any kid who gets too close to falling off before they go over. He calls himself the catcher in the rye. Phoebe, practical as ever, points out that he's misremembering the poem the phrase comes from. A Robert Burns poem about two people meeting in a field, not children falling off a cliff. Holden doesn't care. His version is the one that matters to him, because it isn't really about the poem at all. It's a boy who couldn't save his own brother, imagining a version of the world where he gets to save every child from falling. A fantasy built entirely out of a grief he's never been allowed to name directly. Before Holden can fully unravel, Salinger gives him one more chance at connection with an adult, and it's the most quietly complicated scene in the entire novel. Holden visits Mr. Antolini, a former English teacher he respected and trusted, hoping for a place to stay and, on some level, guidance he can't get anywhere else. Antolini is warm, genuinely intelligent, and offers Holden some of the most direct, caring advice in the whole book, warning him gently that he's on a path toward a serious fall if he doesn't find something to commit to, something outside himself worth caring about. For a moment, it looks like Holden might have found the adult connection he's been missing the entire novel. Then, later that night, Holden wakes up in the dark to find Mr. Antolini sitting beside the couch, patting his head. Startled and deeply unsettled, Holden makes an excuse, grabs his things and leaves immediately, spending the rest of the night wandering, sleepless, uncertain whether he badly misread an innocent gesture of affection or narrowly avoided something predatory. Salinger deliberately never resolves which it was. What matters, narratively, is the effect. The one adult who seemed to genuinely see and care about Holden becomes, in a single unclear moment, one more reason Holden can't trust anyone, and one more thing collapsing underneath him at the worst possible time. By this point, exhausted, unslept, and completely out of money and options, Holden has essentially run out of road. He decides, with the kind of impulsive, half-formed logic that's defined this entire journey, that he's going to head out west, live alone, pretend to be a deaf mute so he never has to talk to anyone phony again, and simply disappear from the world that keeps hurting him. He arranges to say goodbye to Phoebe one last time before he goes. She finds out about his plan and insists, furiously, that she's coming with him, packing an actual suitcase, refusing to be left behind the way everyone else has already left Holden behind. And it's here, faced with a real possibility of dragging his little sister into his own collapse, that something in Holden finally gives. He can't do to Phoebe what the world has done to him. He tells her he isn't going anywhere after all. The novel's final major scene is quiet, almost anticlimactic on the surface, and it's exactly why it works. Holden takes Phoebe to the zoo and then to a carousel in Central Park. Phoebe rides it, reaching for the gold ring the way kids do, and Holden, soaked from a sudden rainstorm, not caring, refusing to go stand under shelter, just watches her. He tells us in one of the most quoted lines in the book that if kids fall trying to grab for that ring, you have to let them fall. You can't say anything. That's just part of it. It's an enormous shift from the fantasy he described to Phoebe only a day earlier. The version of himself standing guard at the edge of the rye field, catching every child before they fall. Now, watching his actual sister ride an actual carousel, Holden seems to understand, at least for one rain-soaked moment, that you can't actually catch everyone. You can't freeze the people you love at the edge of childhood forever. Growing up, and falling sometimes, is simply what happens. And loving someone doesn't mean preventing that. It means being present for it anyway. Salinger doesn't let this moment resolve into a clean, triumphant ending. He doesn't need to. The novel's opening and closing chapters have already told us Holden ends up somewhere else entirely. In that hospital in California, telling this whole story in retrospect, still not sure what he thinks about any of it, still not sure he wants to grow up, still missing, as he says near the very end, everybody. Even the people who annoyed him, even the phonies, even Stradlater and Ackley and Morris, the pimp who scared him. Because that's the thing about telling someone your whole story. Holden warns us in the final lines. Once you do, you start missing everybody. The Catcher in the Rye gets simplified, a lot of the time, into a story about teenage rebellion against a fake, hypocritical adult world. And there's real truth in that reading. Holden's contempt for phoniness isn't paranoid or wrong. Plenty of the adults and institutions around him really are performing, really are more interested in appearances than substance. His anger is often earned. But underneath the rebellion is something much more specific and much sadder. This is a novel about a boy who lost his younger brother at 13, was never given real space or tools to grieve that loss, and spent the following 3 years channeling all of that unprocessed pain into contempt for a world that let it happen. His obsession with protecting innocence, the ducks, the Ryefield fantasy, his fierce loyalty to Phoebe, isn't really about children in general. It's about Allie, over and over, in every form Holden can find to keep trying and failing to save him retroactively. Salinger also builds the novel around a very specific, very American post-war anxiety. The fear that becoming an adult necessarily means becoming fake, trading your real self for a performance that keeps the machinery of jobs, institutions, and social approval running smoothly. Holden isn't wrong that a lot of adulthood, as modeled by the people around him, looks like exactly that kind of compromise. Where the book pushes back on him, gently, through Phoebe, and through that final image on the carousel, is the idea that growing up has to mean becoming phony. Growing up, Salinger seems to suggest, actually just means learning to stand at the edge of the field and watch the people you love take the risk of falling. Not because you've stopped caring, but because that's the only kind of love that actually lets people live. It's also worth sitting with why this particular book has provoked such strong, opposite reactions for over 70 years. Some readers meet Holden and feel instantly, permanently understood, like someone finally wrote down the exact shape of their own adolescent loneliness. Other readers find him exhausting, self-pitying, unable to see his own privilege or his own hypocrisy. Salinger doesn't resolve that tension for you, and that's probably deliberate. Holden is both of those things at once. A genuinely perceptive kid catching real hypocrisy other people are too polite to name, and a grieving, self-absorbed teenager who can't yet see how his own pain is distorting everything he looks at. The book asks you to hold both truths at the same time, the same way you'd have to with an actual 16-year-old going through something this big without any real support. Holden Caulfield never tells us exactly how he gets better, or whether he fully does. The book ends the way real recovery often starts, not with a clean resolution, but with someone finally, honestly, telling their story out loud to somebody, even if that somebody is just the reader. 70 years later, teenagers still read this book and feel like Salinger somehow reached into their specific loneliness and wrote it down. That's not an accident. Holden isn't a rebel for the sake of rebellion. He's a grieving kid, doing the best he can with almost no help, trying to protect a world he loves from falling apart the same way his own world already did. And maybe that's the real reason this novel refuses to age out of relevance. Nearly everyone, at some point, has stood on their own version of that hill above the football game, furious at a world that seems to be moving on without them, wishing someone would just stand at the edge of the field and catch them before they fall. If this breakdown helped the story click for you, subscribe. We're going through the books your teacher assigned, but nobody actually explained. Next up, a novel about a burning temperature in a country that decided reading itself was the crime. See you there.